I thought the story of this film was very good and quite well written. It was gripping. It was at times very intense. And it wasn't as predictable as current films often are. It kept my attention all the way through without thinking that it had to rely on non-stop action to keep the pace of the story moving. In fact, at times, the pace was quite slowed down. But the setting of the film was bad. Hello, and welcome back to another installment of Film Friday, in which I review a new film every single week. This week we're looking at the 2024 film entitled Civil War, directed by Alex Garland and starring Kirsten Dunst and Wagner Moura. Let's get into it. I went to see the film Civil War back when it came out, and I left the theater with a somewhat mixed reaction. Although, overall, I liked it very much. I think the story of this film was good, but the setting of it was bad. And I'll explain further what I mean by that in a moment. But first, from a technical perspective, here are some things that the film did very well. The score was great, generally speaking. There were some moments that were weaker than others, and some of the song choices felt a little out of place, but overall the score worked quite well to improve the film. And then for some moments there was a marked absence of score, which was quite powerful in its own right. The cinematography was good. Although I didn't find it to be outstandingly impressive, it worked well with the film, and there were several scenes, especially towards the end of the film, which were quite remarkable. One problem I did have with the cinematography, though, was that the IMAX format felt kind of overused. Now, perhaps this is unfair to levy against this film, but I am accustomed to IMAX sequences being used to highlight significant or important moments in the film. And so when there is no difference between normal or IMAX footage, it feels less visually significant. I understand that this may be more of a personal preference rather than an objective flaw in the film, but I didn't understand why every single scene needed to be presented in the expanded aspect ratio that IMAX delivers. The story of Civil War is focused around a group of journalists who are traveling from New York to the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and have to traverse the war-torn landscape in between. The goal of their journey is to make it to the White House and interview the president himself, since he's not given any interviews since the start of the war. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I thought the story of this film was very good and well written, but the setting of it was bad. What do I mean by that? The situation didn't feel real enough. And here's why. There were parts of it that felt very intense and real. It was a personal story, on the ground with individuals and nobodies, not an overarching view of the war from the perspective of political leaders or generals. And don't get me wrong, those kinds of stories can be very interesting also, especially when they're from a war which actually happened in history. But there is something more relatable about looking at the story of ordinary individuals. But the setting was too vague. There was not enough tangible about the situation, and the audience was left with way too many questions. Why were the so-called Western forces in the federal government at war? How did this break out? Which side believed what? Now, I sort of understand why they kept it vague, but by doing so, they removed what could have made it feel so much more real, and made it linger in the minds of the audience even after they had left the theater. Instead, it felt like the filmmakers just played it safe. They showed us a hypothetical America without showing us a possibly real America. Also, the story was centered on a group of journalists who never explicitly make a stand on which side they thought was right. As one of the characters said, "We're not here to ask those questions. We're here to record so that others will ask those questions." So the filmmakers could have very easily kept those characters neutral while making the setting of the film much more relevant. They could have even used modern day political issues without moralizing over which side was right or which was wrong. The journalists were simply there to record the events and horrors of war. Overall, though, I did find this film to be quite interesting, and one of the best new films that I've seen in a while. I would give it an 8 out of 10 and would recommend watching it if you have the chance. With that being said, thank you for watching, and be sure to comment your own thoughts on this film below. And don't forget to subscribe for more movie commentary and reviews.